Picture the courtroom so silent that you could almost hear the tick of the clock on the wall. The wooden benches groaned beneath the weight of fidgeting bodies shifting anxiously. Lawyers rustled papers. The bailiff shifted his position, and the slight scent of varnished wood blended with the tension suspended in the air. Everyone was aware that this was not just a typical day in court. This was the day that patriarch Kody Brown of Sister Wives would have to respond to questions that he had been evading for years. No cameras, no television crews, no blinding lights like the ones he had become so accustomed to. The judge already had filming prohibited, deeming this case too sensitive for public show. But without cameras didn't mean there were no eyes watching. Each of those courtroom eyes was glued to the man who had once marched across television screens as though beyond reach. Kody Brown, the man who openly referred to himself as the leader of a plural family, now sat behind the defendant's table, deprived of the attention he adored so dearly. Hushed whispers arose among the onlookers. Some of the whispers were from journalists jotting down notes, eager to gather every morsel to give to a ravenous group of onlookers gathering outside. Some were from onlookers, some show fans, some old neighbors, some curious faces who just wanted to see history in the making. But the whispers weren't merely out of curiosity, they were rife with shock, disbelief, and even a touch of satisfaction. After years of observing Kody command, control, and divide, finally the tables had turned. Christine Brown was sitting across the room, serene and solid, her attorney whispering something into her ear. She didn't squirm, she didn't stumble. To those aware of her tale, her presence in that courtroom was greater than legal, it was symbolic. For years, she was just one of the many women circling Kody's sphere, muzzled by the codes of spiritual marriage. Today she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her daughter, for her own dignity, and for the hundreds of times she had been informed that her voice didn't count. Behind Christine, Janelle sat in reserved support, her face revealing nothing but her eyes expressing the years of sacrifice and heartache. Meri, although aloof, couldn't conceal the way her lips were pressed firmly together, as if keeping back years of anguish. They weren't presenting the case formally in court, but their mere presence was a reminder to Kody of how far he had sunk. Once, they had been his family, his wives, his pride. Now, they were witnesses, friends of the woman who had been brave enough to stand up to him where he couldn't use his charm or his lies. In a courtroom. The judge came in, and the room fell still. Even the whispers died. The bailiff demanded order, and all of them stood, their movements stiff with expectation. The gavel came down once, a sharp crack that cut through the heavy tension. Kody gazed up, his jaw clenched, his golden curls a bit less pristine than on TV. His stance stiff but revealing nerves he desperately hoped to keep hidden. For the first time, he was not the center of attention. He was just another man whose decisions had come back to haunt him. As he looked around the courtroom, his eyes caught Christine's for a fleeting instant. Her eye didn't blink. She wasn't the same woman who had lived in the background of his partiality toward Robin. She wasn't the supplicant pleading for scraps of attention. Her gaze was steel, unflinching, unfaltering. It was the gaze of a woman who had nothing to lose, and everything to win. The quiet snapped again with the rustle of Christine's lawyer rising, his tone flat but clipped. He presented the case to the judge, every word cutting through the air. The legal plea was straightforward, but forceful. A claim of paternity, custody, and child support for Truly, Christine's youngest child. It wasn't about TV melodrama, the lawyer said. It wasn't about celebrity or revenge. It was about responsibility, accountability, and ensuring a child had what she deserved under the law. Kody shifted restlessly. To the world, he was the patriarch. But not here. Here, titles didn't mean anything. The judge didn't care about his title as patriarch, his code, or his pride. All that mattered was the truth. Was he the father, and if so, would he take on his legal responsibilities? Not merely the convenient spiritual ones he had hid behind for so long. Reporters wrote frantically, their pens struggling to keep pace with the theatrics that lay before them. Some were incredulous. Kody Brown, the man who had once crowed about having 4 wives and close to 20 children, was being coerced into taking a paternity test, like some average guy fending off responsibility. A viewer of the show who had watched him prance around on television would never know the man sitting here now, retracting somewhat beneath the burden of the court's judgment. The judge's eyes rested on him, large and unyielding. There were no producers to cut the scene, no editors to filter his image, no wives to defend his deeds. The silence hung as if the walls were holding their breath for Kody's response. Christine's lawyer spoke once more, this time more loudly, more firmly, voicing what everyone was thinking. This is not about TV, this is not about spiritual union. This is about the law, Your Honor, and the law must rule. Kody swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing anxiously. He needed to say something, to defend himself, but for the first time in his life, words did not fall easily. His strength had always been his voice, the way he could use passion and charm to turn the situation to his favor. But charm was not an option here. Not when Christine was watching, not when Meri and Janelle were standing silently in judgment, not when the judge was not inclined to hear excuses. The air grew heavy. Even the air was holding its breath. Everybody sensed they were witnessing the start of something more than a custody battle. This wasn't merely Christine versus Kody, this was the fall of an empire. The dissolution of years of tightly managed public persona. The revealing of what actually existed below the smiling family meals and scripted confessions on sister wives. When the judge did finally speak, it was in a voice that had finality to it. This court will not be influenced by reputation or appearance. We are here for facts, for truth, and for the child's well-being. This court orders the case to proceed. The gavel came down once more, the crash rebounding like thunder through the courtroom. Kody's shoulders fell just a little. Christine didn't smile, but for an instant there was relief in her eyes. It wasn't over yet, but it was a beginning, a mighty first step towards holding him accountable. The murmurs began again, louder this time, individuals leaning in toward one another, shaking their heads in disbelief, some even nodding in silent approval. The patriarch of sister wives had just been brought low in a manner no episode ever had. This was no television reality drama. This was reality. Raw and brutal. And in that instant, everyone in the courtroom was aware. Kody Brown's story had turned a new page. One not penned by him. One not crafted by producers. One not designed for ratings. This was the story of truth overtaking power. And it was just starting. The courtroom had hardly settled when Christine's choice crashed down like a storm. It wasn't merely another court filing. It was a declaration of independence. A line so starkly drawn in the sand that Kody could no longer step over it. Christine had lived under his rules, under his pecking order, under the burden of his favoritism for years. She had been the third wife, the one who tended to be ignored, the one who struggled to scrounge up crumbs of his time and affections. But when she stood up to him in this courtroom, she wasn't that woman, she was reinvented. No longer simply a wife who had left, but a mother who sought justice. Her attorney spoke in hushed tones, laying out the petition in black and white. The words packed more punch than Christine's pleas. Over the past 7 years, a declaration of paternity, custody, and support. 3 simple-sounding requests to the outside world, but an earthquake to the Browns. For Christine, it was for her daughter truly, who had survived the tension, the wordless dinners, the secret sobs. For truly, this case wasn't about drama. It was about stability, safety, and acknowledgement. Why the world wanted to know. Would Christine ask for a paternity test if everybody already knew that Kody was the father? Since Christine wasn't leaving any door open for denial. For far too long, Kody had been hiding behind half-truths and spiritual loopholes. A spiritual marriage here, a separation there, and always some excuse that enabled him to avoid full accountability. Christine wasn't going to let that happen again. Not when it was her daughter's rights on the line. The test wasn't so much about biology. It was about coercing the law to stamp its seal of approval on what Kody had refused to entirely accept. Kody's face scrunched up as the petition was read. The cameras weren't on, but in his head he could already hear the sister wives' audience gasping. He had made an empire on control, being the hub of every narrative. And now, Christine was turning it around. For once, Kody wasn't the narrator. He wasn't the hero or even the victim. He was the defendant. Christine's action was daring, but it wasn't careless. It was deliberate, strategic, and intensely personal. She had observed him dismiss Truly's needs throughout the divorce process. She had experienced the hurt of him withdrawing, of watching his attention drift nearly completely to Robin and her kids. As Truly wondered why her father seemed absent from her life, Christine had afforded him opportunities. Late-night talks, heartfelt pleas, overtures for peace. But those had all been disregarded. If Kody could not do right by Truly as a father, then Christine would ensure the law did so on his behalf. And that's why this moment counted. To the rest of the world, it could have seemed like a spiteful custody fight, but to Christine it was about reshaping history. For decades, wives like her in the polygamous communities were silenced. Informed their opinions didn't count outside of their husband's domain. But here she was, holding court in a courthouse, insisting on recognition from the same system that had disregarded families like theirs for so long. The bravery of Christine's petition echoed outside the courtroom door. Fans of Sister Wives who had followed the show for years were shocked, filling social media with messages of encouragement. For them, Christine's choice was greater than legal. It was inspiring. She had left Kody physically, but now she was severing the final ties that bound her and her daughter to his grasp. She was demonstrating to millions of women that no matter how long you've walked in someone else's shadow, you can step into your own light. Within the courtroom, however, the action felt like dynamite. Christine's attorney didn't mince words. He presented Kody's absence of engagement since the breakup, his sporadic support, and his refusal to take responsibility. Each sentence peeled away another layer of Kody's meticulously constructed public persona. The once proud patriarch, who had professed to care for all his wives, was now being shown as a man evading responsibility, abandoning one child emotionally and financially. Kody bristled, his fists clenching on the table. He wished to burst, to bellow back, to remind them all of the concessions he had made. The decade of keeping his family intact, the relentless pressure of living in the public eye. But he couldn't. The courtroom wasn't his theater, and the judge wasn't an audience to applaud his orations. Each outburst would only serve to bolster Christine's argument. So he sat, seething, his quiet more vocal than any words. Christine, on the other hand, remained calm. She didn't sneer. She didn't gloat. She didn't even yell. Her strength was her composure. The Christine of years gone by would have caved under Kody's glare, but the Christine sitting before me today looked straight ahead with quiet resolve. Each time her attorney spoke, she nodded slightly, her expression firm, her message clear. This isn't about revenge. This is about Truly. And that was the most courageous thing she did. Christine wasn't doing it for herself. She wasn't seeking spousal support, assets, or a public apology. She wasn't attempting to shame him. She was doing it for her child. In a world where Kody had always prioritized his authority over his family's feelings, Christine was finally demonstrating what real authority was. A mother's strength to put her child first. However uncomfortable, however public, however painful. The onlookers in the courtroom leaned forward, enthralled. They were not seeing a legal proceeding. They were witnessing a power shift. The son of Kody's life, for years had been the center around which his wives orbited. But in this courtroom, the axis had shifted. The force that drew everything into their orbit now was Christine, and Kody was fighting to catch up. The judge heard carefully, his gaze flicking over the papers in front of him. The demands were straightforward, the argument compelling. Christine wasn't here to mess around. She was here to make the law do what Kody could not bring himself to acknowledge. That Truly should have more. That her life couldn't be put into the hands of a father who showed up and left at whim. This was the start of a horror for Kody, because Christine's bold action wasn't solely about Truly. It was about establishing a precedent. If she won here, it opened the door for other wives to do the same. Janelle, who had slipped away quietly, could have her own claims. Meri, who had suffered years of abandonment, could follow. One court petition could become an avalanche, crushing the empire Kody had created under the burden of court orders and judgments. Christine understood this. She didn't speak the words, but the meaning hung in every look, every utterance of her attorney. You don't get to leave without repercussions. Not this time. And so the courageous gesture grew into something greater than a petition. It grew into a declaration, a fissure in the very foundation of Kody's power. Regardless of how the trial went, one thing was certain: Christine had altered the power dynamic once and for all. The whispers began anew as the judge accepted the petition. His tone resolute: the case would proceed, evidence would be scrutinized, and Kody Brown would be questioned, that no Sister Wives episode could ever edit out. Christine leaned back, her expression serene, her heart firm. She had played her hand, the biggest hand so far. And in the silence, Kody became aware of something terrible. For the first time in his existence, he wasn't the man of authority. Kody Brown had always thought he was bigger than life. On TV, he pranced with swagger, golden curls bobbing as he declared himself the leader of a non-traditional family. He was the patriarch who kept 4 wives, almost 24 kids, and an ever-present limelight in order. For all those years, that picture had potency. Potency over his wives. Potency over the narrative. Potency over how the world perceived him. But in the courtroom, that potency disappeared like smoke. Seated at the defendant's table, Kody seemed smaller than he had ever been on television. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw clenched, his eyes flitting worriedly between his attorney and the judge. He was not sporting the easy grin fans remembered, the smirk that once did for him what it took to disarm critics or ease tension in family fights. No, this was a man without armor. A man who knew for a certainty that charm would not get him out of this. His ego had ever been his greatest tool. On Sister Wives, he bragged about being provider, protector, and patriarch. He would remind his wives, and the world at great length, how much weight rested on his shoulders. And to some, he almost seemed like a hero. A man with a burden few could comprehend. But in court, the story was no longer his to narrate. Christine's petition came at him like a gut punch. A paternity test? Custody rights? Child support? These weren't mere legal jargon. To Kody, they were knives to his pride. In his head, Christine wasn't just challenging his fatherhood. She was questioning who he was. For years he had established himself as leader of a plural household. The father who offered spiritual and emotional direction to his children. And now, a judge was demanding forms, exams, and financial records to substantiate the very thing he assumed was beyond question. The whispers in the courtroom were not helpful. He felt the gaze on him, some of it pitying, some mocking, some quietly amused to see the great patriarch brought low. He resented it. For all those years, people had tuned in to see him, to hear his version, to witness the family soap through his eyes. Now, they watched him writhing in silence. His dominance of the agenda was lost. And with it, his assurance fractured. Kody's ego had nothing to do with pride. It had everything to do with control. In his marriages, he had always been the final authority. Where they lived, how money was spent, how time was allocated, his say counted. Even when the wives resisted him, even when they pushed against him, he manipulated his way back into power. He defaulted to being the patriarch, the one who was divinely appointed to lead. But in court, it didn't matter. The judge didn't refer to him as head of household. The court wasn't interested that he had, at one time, managed 4 wives. To them, he was simply the respondent, one man under interrogation about his responsibilities toward his child. That awareness grated on him. He rocked back and forth in his seat, his hands tapping on the table, his thoughts tumbling over things he wished he could tell them. He wanted to inform the court of his sacrifices, of the late nights, of the stress of shooting while attempting to raise a big family. He wanted to remind them that he was not every father. He was a man who had shouldered more responsibility than most could ever dream of. But each time he tried to speak, his lawyer shot him a warning look. The courtroom was not a confessional. The judge was not interested in speeches. And so Kody sat, seething silently, his pride shrieking inside as his face flashed angers, humiliation, and fear. Christine's serenity made it worse. Each time she nodded to her lawyer's words, each time she leaned back without a flicker of uncertainty, it eroded him. She was no longer afraid of him. She wasn't expecting him to approve, wasn't counting on a miracle of change of heart. She had moved on. That, and the legal fight, disturbed him to his very core. For so long, Kody had been the center around which his wives orbited. But Christine's unwavering presence taught him something frightening. She no longer needed him. And if Christine didn't require him, if Janelle had already left, if Meri had at last released him, then who was Kody Brown without his wives? To affirm his status as patriarch. The idea tormented him. He attempted to reassure himself that he had Robin, his sole remaining wife, his faithful supporter. But even that solace seemed tenuous in this environment. Robin wasn't here to stand up for him, to protect him, to support him with words and tears of allegiance. Here he was alone, and the loneliness gnawed at him. While the attorneys argued, Kody's mind ran back over the years. He remembered the scenes where he had announced his love for all of his children. He remembered the people who used to look up to him and admire that he could keep so many relationships going at the same time. He remembered when he would tell Christine she was being melodramatic, that she needed to get over his rules. He used to think that he was dictating the script. But now, Christine had fought that control away with one legal petition. His ego murmured deceptions to him at that time. She's doing this to hurt you. She's bitter. She's jealous. She's playing her hand too hard. But secretly another voice intruded. The voice he silenced. The voice that acknowledged Christine was right. The voice that acknowledged he had failed as a father during the divorce. The voice that confessed his favoritism towards Robin had left the rest of the kids feeling abandoned. That voice terrified him more than the judge, more than Christine's lawyer, more than the headlines that would soon be written. Because if he confessed to it, even to himself, then the pillar of his ego would disintegrate entirely. So he struggled with it the best way he knew how, by keeping his chin up, by glowering around the room, by talking himself into the belief that he still had things under his control. But the facade was beginning to crack. The judge picked up on his restlessness. The onlookers picked up on his restless shifting. Even Christine noticed. Her cool growing more intense. The more Kody struggled to keep his discomfort hidden. The great patriarch was coming apart. Not in a blow-up, but in a painful creeping awareness that his authority had boundaries. His ego had taken him far on TV, but in the courtroom, ego was simply static. Before the judge requested a short recess, Kody realized the burden of something he had not felt in years. Fear of losing Christine. No, she was gone. Fear of losing Meri or Janelle. No, they had already departed. But fear of losing the only thing that defined him. His position as father, leader, patriarch. He rose slowly, legs leaden, face expressionless to the audience. To the audience, he seemed tranquil, but within him ego was crumbling. Christine neither looked up nor spoke as she collected her notes. She didn't have to. Her silence spoke volumes. The control was gone from him. And as Kody exited the courtroom during recess, one thing rang truer than the rumors, truer than the sound of the gavel, truer than his ego's protestations. For the first time in his life, Kody Brown wasn't being trailed. He was being left behind. The courtroom air was thick, almost claustrophobic. Each sound was heightened. The rustle of documents, the creak of a chair, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the distance. But beneath those little sounds, there was something so much louder. Silence. Silence as piercing it, pushed against everyone's chest, requiring them to listen carefully to every movement, every breath, every glance shared. The judge had been adamant from the start. This hearing would not be taped, not televised, not made into another episode of Sister Wives. No cameras, no microphones, no editing for dramatic effect to manipulate the story. Whatever transpired here would remain inside these four walls, committed to paper only in legal transcripts and the memories of all who were present. But that choice, while made in the interest of protecting the child's privacy in this case, rendered the silence all the more potent. Without cameras, no performance was necessary. Without an at-home audience, no performances of smiling and scripted lines were required. It was all immediate, unedited. This wasn't reality television. It was reality. And it required a different sort of attention. Christine sat at the plaintiff's table, her attorney occasionally whispering in her ear. She nodded from time to time, but her features were expressionless, serene on the outside. In her mind, her heart galloped with full force. Years of psychological tension had brought her to this point, and although she seemed composed, she felt a weight bearing down on her shoulders. But whereas in those years, she had borne it alone, now she bore it with a purpose. Each breath reminded her that this wasn't revenge, or proving Kody wrong. It was standing tall for truly. Opposite her, Kody sat stiff, his attorney nearby, mouthing plans. His eyes flicked back and forth, from Judge to Christine to the crowd, seeking mastery that was not present. The silence trapped him, allowing him no space to posturize. On TV, he could always fill a silence with words, fill the air with his big voice, or deflect blame with emotion and energy. Here that silence engulfed him. Behind Christine in the gallery, sat Meri and Janelle side by side. Theirs wasn't a screaming, dramatic presence, but it was intense. Each had her own history of suffering, her own reasons for abandoning Kody. But united, they symbolized something unstated: solidarity. They were present not only as witnesses, but as unspoken reminders of all the promises that had been broken, all the tears that had been cried, all the nights spent by oneself, while Kody's focus wandered elsewhere. They said nothing, but their silence shouted volumes. The courtroom was full of other faces, as well, journalists scribbling away, nosy locals straining their necks to get a glimpse, and even some recognizable faces from within the Brown family fold. Each of them added to the tension, their presence reminding Kody that this was not a private issue. His life, once tightly scripted for the public eye, was now picked apart in real time. Every detail open for viewing in front of strangers who would take the tale outside these walls. The quiet was nearly suffocating when Christine's attorney rose and started speaking. His tone, even and deliberate, sliced through the air like a knife. He presented the facts, one at a time, each word resonating in the quiet. The legal petition, a statement of paternity, custody, support. The law stood firm, and the quiet that surrounded his words made them ring out. As he spoke, Kody fidgeted in his seat. He clenched his fists, drummed his foot, readjusted his tie. He was agitated, on edge, and the quiet left him no refuge. There was no laugh track to mute his exasperation, no cutaway to another wife to commiserate. Each tick, every look, every clench of his jaw, was seen. The courtroom did not permit him to take cover behind the television-created character. Christine didn't blink. She sat upright, eyes forward, her composure exuding solidity. The quiet was on her side. It added gravity to her presence, made each nod, each regular breath, look deliberate. She didn't have to shout or scream. Her silence spoke volumes of years spent waiting, years spent being patient for this moment, when she could finally be heard without being cut off, dismissed, or drowned out. The judge listened attentively, his expression impassive, but his eyes piercing. He, too, had learned the force of silence. He kept long pauses between statements, as if he was letting every person in the room have time to absorb the gravitas of words. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with implication, pressing down on all the people in the room, until even the smallest thing felt monumental. At one moment, Christine's attorney faced Kody and posed a blunt question. The resulting silence was oppressive. Kody's mouth began to open, then shut again, his attorney putting a restraining hand on his arm. The judge raised an eyebrow, expectant. Seconds became forever. In those seconds, Kody's ego began to break further. The man who never was at a loss for words was reduced to silence, the kind that spoke volumes more than any words ever could. For the audience, it was a revelation. Many had been watching the show for years, sitting through hours of Kody's booming voice, speaking over conversations, seeing him take control time and again. To watch him silence, to watch him stripped of his act, was unbelievable. The silence of the courtroom revealed him in a way no reality TV show ever could. The silence also revealed something else: the quiet strength of the women he had underestimated. Christine's stillness was more powerful than any speech. Janelle's steady gaze carried the weight of years of sacrifice. Meri's tight-lipped composure spoke of wounds never fully healed. Together their silence formed a wall, one Kody couldn't climb, one the judge couldn't ignore. As the hearing progressed, The silence enfolded each exchange. Whenever Christine's attorney spoke, the room leaned forward, the silence making his words louder. Whenever Kody shifted in his seat, the silence amplified his discomfort. The lack of cameras meant that nobody was playing to the crowd. Every movement, every look, every pause was real. And when those things were real, the silence was deafening. By the time the judge requested a brief recess, the quietness had impressed itself. Everyone present in that room knew the seriousness of what they were witnessing. This wasn't about some mother insisting on assistance for her kid. This was about truth being told where once there had been lies and excuses. It was near the end of Kody's domination, the shattering of his well-engineered ego, and the emergence of the women who once dwelled in his shadow. When the gavel was struck by the judge, the ringing sound was like that of a gunshot. The silence was immediate, darker now and built upon with the understanding that this was just the start. Christine quietly began to collect her papers. Janelle and Meri standing behind her, moving in purposeful and controlled action. Kody remained seated for an additional moment, his eyes fixed on the table before him, his mind whirling, his ego shaking. The quiet courtroom had spoken more loudly than any voice ever could, and in that silence, power was tipped irreversibly. The hush of the courtroom remained even after the recess. But when the case turned towards finance, another tempest stirred, a tempest based on land, money, and shattered vows. Coyote Pass, a large Arizona estate, had long been the icon of Kody Brown's vision grand. He had described it as the future, where every wife would have her ideal home, next to each other, under his command. But dreams may turn to dust. What once was a land of promise had become a field of battle in resentment, suspicion, and betrayal. And now, all those old scars were being dragged into the courtroom, ripped open before the judge, and torn apart under the cold eye of the law. Christine's attorney painstakingly started spinning the yarn, connecting Kody's financial management with the hardships that had confronted Christine as a single parent. Indeed, each utterance honed the image. The man who had boasted of supporting his family had left members of that family scrabbling, while huge tracts of land lay untended, locked up in red tape, pride, and misplaced devotion. The history of Coyote Pass was straightforward in its origin, but tragic in its outcome. Bought in 2018, the property was intended to bring the family together in one collective dream. Kody had proudly stood before the cameras, outlining his vision for a Brown family compound. There would be a house for each wife. The children would grow up as siblings. Holidays would be spent together in joy. It was going to be their legacy. But what actually occurred was otherwise. As Christine's attorney noted, the land turned into a weapon. Rather than bringing unity, it planted discord. Rather than promoting security, it bred suspicion. Janelle had invested money and faith in the venture, trusting Kody's assurances, only to discover obstacles obstructing her way at every step. Meri, too, was promised a future there, but saw her claim to the land dwindle as her status in Kody's life collapsed. Christine had already left, but the acrid taste of those broken vows remained, and now it hung over every sentence uttered in court. While the lawyer spoke, Janelle sat in the courtroom gallery, her eyes slitted, her face pinched. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was replete with memory. She recalled the meetings, the talks, the deliberate saving. She recalled being instructed to believe in the process, to trust in the dream. And she recalled the bite when she understood the dream was never going to end in her happiness, but only in Kody's dominance. The judge heard it all attentively as the facts came out. How the land was subdivided, how the ownership was split, how the promises had been changed like the sands in the desert. It wasn't just real estate. It was evidence of how Kody exercised his power, how he held out hope before his wives, while making sure he was the one at the center, the one with final say. When Kody's attorney replied, the mood changed. He referred to contracts, deeds, and things obligatory. He reiterated that Kody had donated money, that his motives were based on family togetherness. His tone was cutting, honed, meant to turn the story away from promises broken and towards technicalities legal. But in the weighty quiet of the courtroom, they sounded hollow. Christine's attorney didn't have to challenge each assertion. The reality had already been exposed. The land never was about family, it was about power. And as the reality set in, the fissures in Kody's carefully constructed facade began to widen. Kody himself couldn't remain quiet. He moved forward, his voice thundering across the room, as he attempted to explain, to justify. He talked about dreams, about sacrifices, about the challenges of having such a big family. But the more he spoke, the more it became apparent. It wasn't about sacrifice. It was about control, slipping from his grasp. The judge held up a hand, silencing him. The courtroom stilled once more, the gavel's power reminding all who really was in charge in that room. For Kody, it was another embarrassing reminder. His voice, once authoritative within the family, once projected on national television, no longer carried the final authority. Here, the law spoke louder than ego. For Christine, the land fight was not about numbers and documents. It was symbolic. It was years of being promised security and given uncertainty. It was the imbalance of giving all time, money, devotion, just to be met with neglect. Sitting there silently, listening, her face was serene, but within her was building a sense of justice. At last, the promises given to keep her in check were unraveling when put under examination. Meri, likewise, was weighed down by such promises. She had held on to the hope for years that Coyote Pass would grant her the place she had always wished for, that home representing her value within the family. Yet she was shut out, her part reduced to the periphery. Here she sat in the gallery. Now, understanding the courtroom was not simply about Christine's battle, about her own closure. The broken promised land was more than Arizona acres. It was a map of betrayal, a topography of lost hopes. Every piece bore the tale of a wife who'd hoped, every stake pounded into the ground, denoting another hurt in the family's past. And here in this courtroom, that land was coming out for what it really was. Not a basis for unity, but a battlefield of domination. The quiet that followed the attorney's exchange was oppressive. Journalists wrote frantically, their pens flying to get down every sentence. Onlookers fidgeted in their seats, the tension almost palpable. Everyone knew this wasn't merely about scandal and deeds. It was about truth. It was about power. It was about the fall of a man who was once at the epicenter of it all. As the judge distilled the issues and brought the case to a close, the words hung there like a verdict on the Coyote Pass dream. Whatever legal conclusions would be reached, one thing was certain: the land had been lost. Lost not in title but in spirit. The dream was lost, and no judicial decree could bring it back to life. When the gavel fell once more, the sound reverberated like a shutting door. To Kody, it was the sound of broken promises. To Christine, it was the sound of justice arriving to catch up with 4 years of disappointment. To Janelle and Meri, it was the sound of closure. 4 years too late. The land that was meant to bring them together had instead uncovered the cracks that could never be filled. And now, before the verdict of the law, the legend of Coyote Pass had been destroyed. Another reminder that promises without deeds are but nothing clothed with hope. The silence crept back, deeper than ever. And in that silence, everyone knew the land of broken promises had spoken its truth. Christine sat tall at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her lawyer's papers spread out like weapons ready for battle. But this wasn't about winning for herself. This was about her youngest daughter. Truly, with each beat of her heart, every inhale she took in that quiet courtroom contained one idea: I have to shield her. The judge coughed and shifted the conversation. Now, let's address issues of custody, parenting time and support. The words thundered like a clap of lightning. For weeks prior to this hearing, rumors of a paternity test had circulated in tabloids and blogs. Why would Christine, after all these years, insist on such a thing? For her, the reason was obvious. The law needed clarity, and clarity was what she insisted. She was weary of vagueness, weary of gaslighting, weary of Kody's selective memory. If he was Truly's father, then let it be documented. If he was going to try to avoid responsibility, the truth would pull him into the light. Kody fidgeted in his chair, his expression pinched. The demand for a paternity test had hurt him, not because he was unsure the child was his, but because it destroyed the illusion he had worked so desperately to keep, that he was still the patriarch, still respected, still trusted. To have his own daughter's paternity called into doubt in court was a blow to his pride. But Christine hadn't done it to embarrass him. She'd done it to secure Truly's future. Christine's attorney stood and spoke quietly. Your Honor, we are requesting that the court determine legal paternity, order custody arrangements, and enforce financial support for Truly Brown. My client has cared for her daughter in large part on her own, since she walked out of this marriage. She is entitled to stability. Truly is entitled to stability. Each word lingered in the air, weighted with truth. Kody's attorney responded swiftly, talking of Kody's devotion to his children, his track record as a provider, his challenging but sincere efforts to remain involved. He depicted a man beset by circumstance, not a father evading responsibility. His words were practiced, honed, but Christine remained unimpressed. She knew the truth. She recalled the nights she spent alone, the bills she juggled, the countless explanations she provided to her daughter when Kody did not show up. Christine did not lash out. She did not cry. She simply spoke when it was her turn. Her voice firm, crisp, and heart-wrenching. Your Honor, this isn't about me. This isn't even about him. It's about Truly. She deserves to know that her father is there for her. Not just in words. Not just on television. But in reality. She deserves to have the same support and recognition as any other child. The courtroom lapsed into silence once more. Her words were more piercing than any of the lawyer's arguments. This was a mother speaking out of her heart, not memorizing lines for an act, not weighing appearances. Kody leaned forward, his jaw clenched. I love my daughter, he said suddenly, breaking protocol by speaking directly, instead of through his lawyer. His voice boomed, filling the room with familiar energy. I've always loved my daughter. This he gestured at Christine, frustration dripping from every word. This is just another attack on me. Another attempt to make me look like the villain. The judge's gavel cracked once. Mr. Brown, you will answer when allowed. Kody sat back, his face red. He didn't like being shut up. Not by Christine. Not by Meri. Not by Janelle. No way by a judge. But here he was, having been pushed into the very thing he despised most, accountability. Christine didn't bat an eye at his tantrum. She didn't even glance in his direction. Rather, she fixed her gaze on the judge, her voice steady as she went on. Your Honor, I am not here to destroy him. I am here to make sure my daughter gets what she requires. This is not revenge. This is responsibility. The words resonated through the courtroom. Even Meri and Janelle, sitting quietly in the gallery, looked at each other. They had known Christine as the wife who laughed, who attempted to keep the peace, who habitually bent herself to maintain harmony. But here she was now, steel in her spine, fire in her voice, standing taller than she ever had. The judge nodded slowly, taking notes. He requested evidence, school costs, doctor bills, ledgers of Kody's payments or absence thereof. Christine's attorney had them in order. Each item of proof, another brick in the wall she was constructing about Truly's future. Kody's attorney attempted to object, to poke holes in them, but the records were difficult to discredit. They spoke more loudly than apologies. The topic turned to custody. Christine requested primary custody, visitation rights for Kody. Her reasoning was straightforward. Stability. Truly required one home base, one constant presence, one parent she could count on day in and day out. And that parent was Christine. Kody's attorney made the case for more equal time, presenting Kody as a devoted father unfairly relegated to the sidelines. But as the judge heard, his eyes darted frequently toward Kody himself. The way he squirmed in his seat, the way he bristled at Christine's every sentence, the way his irritation seemed to overwhelm his interest in his daughter. Christine had once produced a photograph. She handled it softly, as if in reverence, before slipping it across the judge's bench. This, she said quietly, is my daughter on her last birthday. Her father was not there. The photo was not sensational. A small girl with a happy smile next to a cake. It was that lack of drama that held the truth. A moment that should have been had been lost. Another memory Christine had borne alone. The silence after that photograph was intolerable. Kody changed again, his defenses dismantling beneath the pressure of something he could not fight against. Absence. The judge cleared his throat, looking thoughtful. He did not make a ruling at that moment. that would come afterward. But the atmosphere changed. The power dynamic swung further away from Kody, further toward Christine and the quiet truth she bore. Christine breathed slowly, her hands remaining firm. She understood the fight was far from over. But in this moment she felt the force of each decision she had ever made to arrive at this place. It wasn't about escaping so much as it was about keeping truly safe. And now, standing within the chill of a courtroom, she realized she was winning not just a case. She was winning Truly's future. For Kody, the silence was choking. The cameras were not on. But his image, his reputation, his pride, all were being torn apart in front of his own eyes. He had lost control of the story. No manner of booming addresses or fiery valedictions could cover up the truth. He was being laid bare, not by Christine's fury, but by her measured, unyielding quest for justice. When the judge finally called another recess, the gavel's crack echoed again like a warning. The fight wasn't over. But for Christine, each gavel strike was one step closer to the closure she deserved. She picked up her belongings, upright as she walked away from the table. Behind her stood Janelle and Meri, looking her in the eyes with something unspoken but strong pride. She wasn't simply doing this for Truly. She was doing this for every broken promise, every tear that had been cried, every wife who had ever been silenced by the ego of Kody. And in that instant, as silence surrounded them again, Christine was sure of one thing. This courtroom was not Kody's turf. It belonged to her. And she was not backing down. The cracks were beginning to show. From the first gavel bang, Kody Brown had entered the courtroom with his pride ahead of him as a shield. For generations he'd been the patriarch, the man with the solutions, the hub of every conversation, the voice that boomed over dissent. On film, in confessionals, in family gatherings, his was always the loudest opinion. But here in the aseptic stillness of the courtroom, that shield was cracking. Each time Christine testified with measured assurance, it eroded him. Each time the judge overruled his interjections, it deepened the fissures. Each look from Janelle or Meri, seated in tight solidarity behind Christine, broadened the rift, and with every minute that ticked by, the man once in charge of 4 wives and dozens of children found himself backed into a corner, vulnerable and helpless. The courtroom wasn't about legal wars anymore. It was the mirror Kody had shunned for so long. And what he saw reflected back wasn't the patriarchal leader he envisioned. It was a man whose family had retreated, whose vows had failed, whose dominance didn't count before the law. When his lawyer whispered strategy, Kody leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table as though hanging on for balance. But even his lawyer's polished arguments couldn't mask the reality. Christine's evidence was strong. Her testimony was steady. The silent power of her presence, and the quiet strength of Janelle and Meri's watchful eyes, made Kody look smaller, weaker, more desperate. The judge posed a question regarding monetary contributions. Christine's attorney slid a pile of papers across the table, receipts, bank accounts, records of the weight she had borne alone. The silence as the judge turned them was agonizing. Each turn of the page seemed like a blow to Kody's pride. Finally, unable to take it any longer, Kody spoke up. "Your Honor, I've provided for this family for years. I've sacrificed more than anyone in this room can imagine. I've done everything in my power to keep everyone together." His voice boomed across the courtroom, filled with the same energy that once commanded his wives and children. But this wasn't a living room debate. This was a courtroom. The judge raised his hand sharply. "Mr. Brown, this is not about what you've sacrificed. This is about the needs of your child." The words struck harder than any gavel. For the first time in years, Kody was forced to face the truth. His sacrifices weren't the story anymore. His ego wasn't the centerpiece. His child's needs were. Christine didn't rub it in. She didn't even glance his way. She just kept her eyes ahead, her silence being louder than Kody's tantrum. To the observers, the contrast was noteworthy. One parent calm, steady, intent, the other defensive, boisterous, falling apart. Meri sat in the gallery, her lips drawn into a thin line. She had endured years of being silenced, of seeing her emotions discounted as Kody filled the air with his own. To watch him at last shut up by someone else, by the judge, by Christine's gentle strength, was to feel justice. Janelle, sitting next to her, sat back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Kody, not with anger but with something else: pity. The man who had portrayed himself as larger than life now seemed small, breakable, imploding beneath the pressure of his own ego. Kody's attorney attempted to get back in charge, steering the discussion toward intentions and good faith, but the harm was done. The judge had witnessed Kody's urge to dominate. Christine's serene answers had revealed the contrast, and the silence that attended each explosion only made Kody's unwinding larger. When Christine spoke once more, she did so with a devastation plainness. Your Honor, it's not about the past, it's about here and now, and tomorrow. Truly is worthy of consistency. She is worthy of knowing she can count on me, and if her father is willing, on him too. But that's not for me to decide. It's his. The courtroom came to a halt. Everyone waited for Kody. His face tightened, his jaw clenched. For years he had issued ultimatums, pushed others into corners, demanded loyalty. Now the tables were turned. Christine had put the spotlight on him, and in the crushing silence of the courtroom, he had no place to hide. The burden of expectation weighed upon him. The judge paused. The onlookers leaned forward. Christine's words hung in the air, resonating in the silence. It's his choice. But Kody didn't reply. Not outright. He fidgeted in his seat, mumbled to his attorney, skirted the gazes of his former wives. The silence was thickening by the second. And in that silence, his ego weakened further. Because the truth could not be denied. Christine was not begging him for help. She was not pleading with him for support. She was not clinging to him, fighting to keep him. She was standing there tall and proud, with or without him. And that was the bitterest hurt of all. For a man who had insisted on loyalty, obedience and devotion, Christine's autonomy was the greatest insult. As the hearing went on, Kody became more subdued. His initial bluster dissolved into agitated pacing, his thunderous voice reduced to muttering with his attorney and clenched jaw. The courtroom had stripped him of his platform, revealing only raw truth. When the judge declared the day's hearing at an end, the crack of the gavel was like the breaking of glass in the air. Christine arose, her features serene, her hands unshakable. Janelle and Meri stood behind her, a silent barrier of encouragement. Kody sat, his eyes fixed on the table, his pride in tatters around him. The back row reporters scribbled madly, recording the moment that would become headlines. Kody Brown silenced in court. The man who had constructed his persona on control, authority and charisma, had been brought low to a shadow of his former self, revealed not through a high-stakes showdown, but by the patient, unyielding courage of the women, once content to stand in his shadow. As Christine exited, the silence accompanied her, but it no longer felt heavy. For her, it was freedom. For Kody, still sitting, it was being smothered. And in his heart he knew the courtroom had not just tried to overturn his power, it had destroyed his ego. The courtroom was chilly now, though perhaps it was simply the gravity of what had transpired. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above, and the silence, always the silence, hung over the room like a wet shroud. Everyone was aware this was it. The last session, the time that would either verify or destroy the man who had once occupied the center of an empire of wives and children. Kody Brown sat rigid in his chair, knuckles pale with tension, as he clenched the table. The deep voice he had maintained for so long, the swagger he wore like a cloak, had been eroded bit by bit. Now, as the judge stood to give his final words, Kody slumped beneath a burden much greater than court papers, the burden of his own disintegration. Christine, meanwhile, exuded serenity. Her gaze remained fixed, her respiration steady. She wasn't here to demolish Kody, though that was what the media would report later. She was here for truly, for justice, for closure. And in her quiet, she bore the power of every choice that had brought her to this point. The judge started, his tone steady and measured. He talked of evidence laid out, of testimony given, of the unshakable truth set before the court. He spoke of Christine's unshakable presence, her meticulous records, her refusal to depart from concern for her daughter's welfare. He spoke too of the tantrums, the uncooperativeness, the refusal to accept responsibility on the other side. Kody's attorney shifted uncomfortably, but even he recognized the tide had turned. The judge's words were not mere comments, words of warning. And then the ruling. The judge proclaimed legal paternity established. There would be no doubt, no ambiguity, no means for Kody to get through loopholes. He was Truly's father in the eyes of the law. With that came responsibilities, financial support, medical contributions, and explicit custody arrangements. Christine received primary custody, with visitation awarded to Kody under strict rules. It was a ruling based on not punishment, but stability. Truly required one stable home. She already had it with Christine. The court simply confirmed what reality had long established as true. The gavel came down once. The sound reverberated like thunder in the silent room. For Christine, it was the sound of victory, not the loud, boastful one, but the quiet, dignified one. She had held her ground, battled with facts rather than rage, and in the end, truth had prevailed. For Kody, the sound was a dagger. The gavel wasn't a symbol of judgment. It was the sound of his control crumbling. For years he had juggled dominance with 4 women, telling himself he was the leader, the provider, the irreplaceable center. Now, in the matter of a decision, that fantasy dissipated. The law had spoken, and he was no longer the man in charge. Silence following the gavel was brutal. The courtroom was holding its breath as Christine gathered papers, her hands calm, deliberate. Janelle and Meri stood behind her, their figures like specters of the past, now become pillars of strength. Kody sat, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His hands trembled ever so slightly. He had always thought he could talk his way out of any situation, talk himself back into being in charge, or if not that, spin the story so it reflected on him positively. But there was no cutting room in this life. No TLC cameras to recut the show. No wives left to bear the brunt of his decisions. He was alone. Journalists frantically wrote, already constructing the headlines that would reverberate across social media. Kody Brown ordered to pay child support. Christine wins custody. The man who once marketed the image of a cohesive plural family, now stood revealed as broken, discarded, and vanquished. Christine didn't glance back at him when she exited the courtroom. She didn't have to. Her silence was sufficient. The fight was won, and she had emerged victorious, with the one thing she cared about most: protection for her daughter. Meri and Janelle trailed behind her, their footsteps steady, their expressions unreadable. They were not here to party with Christine's victory. They were here to see Kody's comeuppance. For years they had been voices in the distance, their fears swamped by Kody's booming voice. Today they had heard him silenced, not by rage, not by confrontation, but by the steady, unblinking truth. Kody stood at last, his body leaden, his face white. His attorney said something quietly, but Kody hardly heard the words. He gazed around the almost vacant room, the silence constricting, and for the first time ever, he had no audience. No one was there to hear his version, no one waiting to cling to his explanations. The courtroom had heard it all, and deemed it inadequate. As he stepped outside, the press closed in, voices piercing, questions incessant. Kody, what do you think of the verdict? Will you appeal? Do you regret how you approached the marriage? He held up his hand, as if to hush them, but words stuck in his throat. The thunderous voice that once commanded obedience was lost, replaced by the empty space of a man who had at last run out of control. At the same time, Christine walked outside into the sunlight, the warmth on her face. She took a deep breath, the years weighing less heavily upon her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped, silenced, or eclipsed. She felt free, and while the path that lay ahead would not be without its flaws, she did know this with absolute certainty. The future of her daughter was safe, and it was she herself who had brought them there. This was bigger than a court win. It was a tale of transformation, of a woman who had once lived in the shadow of a man's ego, stepping fully into her own strength, of broken promises, reformed into lessons learned, of silence once wielded as control, now turned into a weapon of empowerment. The world would discuss the ruling, the custody, the child support, but the people who knew better knew this was more. This was the downfall of Kody's ego, the destruction of his well-orchestrated persona. and the emergence of the women who had been underappreciated for too long. And so the doors of the courthouse shut behind them. One chapter done, not with yelling, not with destruction, but with a silence that was more powerful than anything Kody might have said. The final blow wasn't the gavel. It wasn't the decision. It wasn't even Christine's serene victory. The final blow was the truth. And the truth had finally prevailed.